There's actually some pretty huge news in the front of comic books when it comes to Marvel and DC, and that is actually that for the first time in over 20 years, they are going to do a crossover, an official crossover in one-shot comic books, crossing over the universes of Marvel Comics and DC Comics. Now, here's the thing. There have been crossovers in the past. We'll talk about it for a couple minutes today, but I do have a question of the day for you, which is, did you ever check out like the 90s and early 2000s crossovers? And what do you think about them, I guess? I actually grew up on those. It was one of the things that made me enjoy both Marvel and DC, was seeing characters like Access that crossed over between these two worlds, seeing different things like that. I thought it was neat, but at the same time, it was short-lived. And, there's a lot of things that have changed in comic books, especially since the 90s and early 2000s. Even look at a character like Tim Drake, I'm going to get in trouble here. We're probably not going to see him dating Jubilee this time because of the direction that, they've taken him with DC Comics, which I got in trouble for last time I talked about. So we'll move past it. That said, I'm interested in seeing what will happen here because previously, I believe the last one, it was a crossover with the Justice League of America and Avengers. And I believe that was done back in something like 2003. I can show a little bit of art from previous crossovers, but there was even a point where you had the Amalgam universe where you had characters like Superman actually mixed together with Captain America, or you'd have characters like, Wolverine and Batman mixed together into their own character. I actually have a lot of these original DC and Marvel comics, and I will also include a link to them. They're going to be in my one superhero Amazon list, which I get commission for if you buy something from that. They did reprint big hardcovers of these crossovers. I personally thought they were a little expensive. They do contain a lot, but I will have those there for you in case you're interested. Now, all of this said, for quite a while, there was a resistance to doing these things. I personally thought it was kind of stupid. I always thought that if you have a crossover and it's going to be fun, it's going to preserve the spirit of these characters, and it's going to, I guess I would say, propel them forward in some way and not just be a throwaway thing. I like it. Now, in the age of the multiverse, as much as I still enjoy the multiverse stories, I think that crossovers have become common, not necessarily as much between brands, but more between worlds. The idea of those barriers being between worlds and those being things that are difficult to cross over, that era is pretty gone, because all the time you'll have this character from this world comes in, this character from this world comes in. That's something that I think they need to avoid with this, is find a way to naturally tell this story. This story is going to be told in 2 one-shot comic books. Essentially, there's going to be a Marvel/DC one-shot and a DC/Marvel one-shot. So obviously, if you don't, if you're thinking like, well, that's not much of a difference, why don't I just pick up one of them? I'm sure that they will connect to each other. And probably what will end up happening is, first off, companies are prideful. I'm sure they both wanted their name first. So this is a way for both of them to get their name first equally. Secondly, I'm sure that somehow, however they do the revenue split, there will be some kind of difference between which one came first. I have no idea how, but I'm sure they worked it out so that they could all make money. That said, we don't know all the details on what it will be. There are a lot of people who are calling this move desperate. A lot of people saying, oh, well, it's because comic books don't sell anymore. This is stupid. But for me, when comic books were still selling, they also did these crossovers. So I think it's neat, because for me, this was a big part of my childhood. That said, there are some interesting elements to this. Like, for example, in the past, there were comments made on why they weren't doing these crossovers. Actually, all the way back, I believe a year or two ago, Marvel Comics VP and executive editor Tom Brevoort actually had talked about this and said DC for the last several years has seemed much more open to doing them, but whenever Marvel does participate in one, there tends to be some reason for this internally, some objective that making a crossover helps us achieve. But each circumstance is different, so I can't tell you why we do each and every one, nor which instances came from Marvel reaching out to others, and which ones were the results of others reaching out to us. Now, that said, I do remember that there was essentially a editor very, very big up, whose name is slipping my mind, I don't know why, who was very responsible for DC not doing these for a long time and said that they were pointless, and said essentially that they didn't actually push forward the DC characters. So you guys can tell me in the comments down below who I'm talking about. It's not bait for comments. I genuinely am just not remembering the name right now. But I do remember that was a big reason DC was not doing this for a bit. It was essentially this kind of stubbornness of, well, you know, we don't need them. We don't need their characters. Our characters stand on their own. Unfortunately, they don't in a lot of ways. There are good comic books, by the way, on both sides of this, of the big two. There's a lot of good independent ones as well. Previously made a video about that, and some stuff coming up that you should take a look at. That said, a lot of comic book characters in recent years have fallen off. From Spider-Man becoming pretty much the ultimate cuck, all the way down to things like, different characters being resurrected over and over again. We're seeing things like Gwen Stacy being resurrected now to become Gwenpool, which makes no sense at all. They're not even the same character. I know I just used a bunch of Marvel examples, but DC has their own examples too. There were a lot of examples of like really pushing silly political agendas in DC. I mean, to the point where they even had to cancel that whole thing with, what was it, Snowflake and Safe Space were going to be comic book characters with DC. Comic books have kind of been up and down. I'm not somebody who thinks that they're just dead. I'm not someone who thinks that they're awful. But when you have stuff like people writing the Red Skull and basically saying, hey, look, it's Jordan B. Peterson. For me, I'm kind of looking at your comic books, and then I'm looking over at Peter Parker, borderline in the corner, watching Paul get it on with MJ, and I'm just kind of shaking my head. You know, I'm just kind of like, what are we doing here? So for me, there are still really good comic books, but that said, I do think they kind of need a kick in the pants. So I wouldn't be surprised if a big motivation for this is sales, but I don't necessarily see the move of crossing these two brands over as just pure desperation, because they've done it multiple times before, and they actually told good stories. I actually really like the DC and Marvel crossovers. I like the amalgam stuff. There was a very interesting storyline, basically between two brothers in the multiverse who were fighting, and they were these entities that represented the Marvel and the DC universe, and sort of them melding and fighting, and that kind of being a big reason behind the storylines of the old crossovers. I thought that kind of stuff was very interesting. Even setting up a character like Access, who was almost like an intergalactic policeman, whose whole point was to try to keep these universes apart for their own good. Then you had even storylines like Star-Crossed Lovers with Jubilee and Tim Drake, where they fit together like two puzzle pieces, but they didn't really work out because their universes, they couldn't stay together. I thought there were a lot of very interesting elements there, and they didn't even all deal with the same stories. You know, in some crossovers you'd have Peter Parker, in some you'd have Ben Reilly as Spider-Man, back when Ben Reilly was a good character. So that's kind of where I'm wondering how this will land. That said, you look at a character like Spider-Man, who I think has largely fallen off in his normal comics, doing well in Ultimate, and you look at someone like Chip Zdarsky writing that character then into his Daredevil run, and the character was amazing in that. So I think it's just going to depend on what kind of effort goes into this, what the actual reasoning is behind this, what the story is, and what that actual objective is. I am interested. I'm excited. I'm glad that this was actually announced very recently, and they actually talked about this and basically said that they were excited for it and that they had another story in them. It's calling this another white whale that they wanted to tackle, essentially a, reference to Moby Dick, and then going on to tease this and say that they were going to do it. I think this is really cool. The audience where they were was very excited. So for me, I am hoping for the best. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I will have lists down there as well for fans of Marvel and DC over on Amazon. You want to buy something that does help support our channel. We do have a Fortnite code as well as that. And we do have our own store, CosmoBunny.shop, where, speaking of comic books, we get comics, manga, magazines, and more that are damaged. What we do is we take that paper, we use resin and repurpose it through a new medium into a new form of art. That's kind of the whole point of transforming art. We take some of that, we preserve some of that art, create something new out of these different things with coasters, keychains, trays, and more, and then we make sure that the rest ends up in the recycling instead of just going into some landfill and killing a bunch of our ocean or being very bad for wildlife. So this is important to us. It gives new life to art. Media preservation is something that has always mattered to us and that we love very much. And hey, you know, I actually recently came into some, I would say some maybe copies of some damaged versions of these old crossovers. So you never know, there might be some stuff that appears that's inspired by this as well. Hope you have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shui.